John Haney here with RealAgriculture.com. This week I had a chance to chat with Erin Gowriluk. She is the president of Canada Grains Council. And we dove into, I think, a really, really important topic. She is concerned about the fact that science is really leaving some of the, I guess, being a focal point of some of the regulatory decision making that is happening, not only in Canada, but around the world. And when it happens around the world and other countries that we're trading with, there's an impact on trade and the amount that we can actually do as an exporting nation. Here's my conversation with Erin Gowriluk of Canada Grains Council. Erin, let's start off the top. I actually would like you to explain to the audience who is Canada Grains Council and what function does it have in the industry as a stakeholder?
Canada Grains Council has 41 individual members, Sean, but we have representation from the entire grain value chain. So from producers to the grain companies, the exporters, the life science companies, processors, we have the entire value chain around one table. And I have since learned when I joined the organization 6 months ago, it turns out this is a pretty unique model. This doesn't exist in every jurisdiction, that you have this commitment to consensus building and collaboration. So that is Canada Grains Council. And in terms of the function or the role that it plays, I think it does two things quite effectively. We've created a forum for those internal discussions, a place for the entire sector to come together and have a conversation about where we may have a common understanding, or at least understand one another's perspectives on some issues where we know we may not be aligned. But then there's a real commitment, certainly on the part of the board, to build consensus and find alignment wherever possible, because we know that we're stronger together.
Yeah, I can imagine with naming some of those stakeholders that not everybody is on the same page on all issues. So, but hey, that leads to what is this saying? Iron sharpens iron, or something like that. Like you probably provides some opportunity for some really, really good discussions to come to better solutions. I think it's usually how that always goes. Okay, I want to talk to you today about some of the concerns, maybe in Canada as well as internationally, where there's regulatory pressures, and we always talk about science-based decision-making, and it's kind of being a little bit left in the lurch for more political or emotional appeal. Why does this have you concerned?
Well, I think this has me concerned because we know that when we base decisions on science, we get one very favorable outcome, and that is that the policies that we establish are ultimately going to lead us in the right direction. They're going to get us closer to where we all want to go. When we bring the science and the data with us and we develop agri-environmental policies that are based on science, we're more likely to achieve our agri-environmental objectives, those targets that we've established. It's when we create these arbitrary targets that are not informed by the science, the data, that aren't going to get us any closer to where we want to go. It's a huge waste of time, and we continue to fuel the misconceptions around agriculture and the environment.
So if we know that's what's happening, why do we continue, and I say we as Canada and other countries around the world, continue to fall into this trap and make this mistake?
I think that look, I can't speak on behalf of government, but my observations would lead me to believe that governments can respond in one of two ways. They can use the science and the data, and they can clearly communicate the science and the data to their constituents, to consumers in their respective jurisdictions, to talk about the reasons why they've taken this decision. And they can speak to the robust scientific process that informs their ultimate decision. It's a more difficult decision to take. It's a more difficult path to take, but we know they're capable of it because we saw them do it during the pandemic, right? We had to lead with science first, and we had to explain to the public why the science was driving some of these policy decisions. The other option that governments can take, and that is they can leverage these misconceptions, I think sometimes in an effort to appear aligned with their own constituents. And in so doing, they fuel these misconceptions, and they ultimately, as I said, will end up building policies and programs around these myths and misconceptions that get us no further ahead. it's often the easier route to take to appear to be aligned with your constituents and leverage the misinformation and their misunderstanding of the issues. But it doesn't typically lead us in the direction that's going to result in more meaningful policy.
So an example, as you're describing that very well, an example that I think of is Mexico's position on the trade dispute with the U.S. on white corn imports. The U.S. is saying Mexico's making a decision here that is political, trying to align with some of the constituents instead of talking about the science. Is that a fair example that I'm coming up with there?
I think there are so many examples, Sean. That's one of many right now. We can point to Mexico, we can point to the European Union, and we can point to our own backyard where we've seen examples where the government will acquiesce under pressure from anti-agriculture or activist groups. And I think, when I reflect on, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago now that we had the North America EU Agriculture Conference in Prince Edward Island. I can't believe this was the first time in my 15 years in this industry that I really had an opportunity to spend time talking to American, Mexican, and European farmers. And I suppose I didn't have a full appreciation for what their perspective might be on some of these issues and some of these decisions that have been taken in Mexico, for example, and in the European Union. And there is not support from the farmer constituents. These farmers do not support the decisions, for the most part, that their governments have taken in the EU and in Mexico. Farmers recognize the challenges that this is going to present for farmers in Mexico and for some of the trade opportunities as well. And there's a level of frustration, certainly, with the government in the case of Mexico, and I don't understand Mexican politics to the extent that I can speak to that. But what I observed was a real frustration from farmers in Mexico because their government has not consulted with them. They don't have an understanding or an appreciation for the real impact that this is going to have on the profitability of Mexican farms and the impact it's going to have on rural economies. But I guess I was heartened to a certain extent to see that, you've got organizations and associations similar to what we have in Canada, for example, with the Grain Growers of Canada and the CFA, that are working on behalf of Mexican farmer interests, and Copa Cogeca in the European Union, for example, fighting on behalf of those farmers, trying to make inroads. So I don't pretend to understand the politics in Mexico, but their farmer constituents are certainly very frustrated with the direction in which these policies are going.
And to add on this, and we talk about the impacts, right? So we like to throw around the phrase unintended consequences when it comes to policy. And I think it's sometimes left out of the narrative when the regulatory lawmaker or people are coming up with some of these policies. They don't think of what happens next. They're very singularly focused. Is sort of always my thought. And this is where food security plays a role. And let's just use the example of nitrogen policy. There's a couple of European countries that this is of much concern, not only to the general public, but also to farmers. So there's farm profitability. But when we're talking about just food security, that becomes a real big problem, and that's left out of the conversation. I don't understand why.
It is left out of the conversation, and I have the same opinion that you do. These may be unintended consequences, but we can't pretend we don't know that this is going to be the impact of these decisions. We can't pretend we don't know. We know, for example, that the impact of the EU's Green Deal or the farm to fork strategy under the Green Deal, once implemented, is going to, depending on the commodity, result in a 24 to 25% decrease in overall production. We know that it's going to lead to an increase of up to or over 10% in the cost of food. That's on top of already record high prices. And that's just what's going to happen within Europe. Consider the consequences beyond Europe on the countries that rely on food from a region, which is going to see an overall decrease by 25% in production. Food is already becoming very unaffordable for many, even European constituents. Imagine what's going to happen under these policies. And we're not having that conversation to the extent that we should be. I recognize that we're facing a crisis with the climate and that has to be addressed. But I mean, I don't mean to sound dramatic. It can't come at the cost of human lives. We have a responsibility to be talking about the impact that COVID, climate, and conflict are having right now on the global population.
Yeah, good point. Okay, now in this realm, this fall, I don't know if it's this month or next month, the EU is going to be making some decisions on glyphosate. And it kind of if you're a lot of times in sports, it's like, well, what does Vegas say? The odds, I know in a note you sent me, odds makers are kind of putting this at a 50-50, what could happen here. I know you're watching this with great interest.
We're watching it with great interest. And I'm going to tell you, we don't have to speculate because the decision is going to be out quite soon. It's mid-October that the final decision will be taken. But I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'll tell you why I'm optimistic. We know, for example, this summer that EFSA, the European Food and Safety Authority, issued their assessment of glyphosate. And the European Commission responded to that assessment only about 2 weeks ago in a recommendation or a proposal that they put forward. And that proposal is that the EU adopt continued use of glyphosate for a period of 10 years. So the last time we had this conversation in Europe, it was 5 years ago. We're going to approach the deadline or the expiry date as of mid-December this year. And so their recommendation, based on the EFSA report, based on the scientific analysis, is that we see continued use of glyphosate in the European Union for a period of 10 years. Now, European member states will vote on that proposal, and they will do that in mid-October, and that's what we're waiting to see the results of. But I'm cautiously optimistic because I think this, in addition to the decision that they've taken with respect to gene editing, are giving us a few, I think, indications that increasingly they recognize the impact of some of these policy decisions, but also the important role that innovation plays in helping them to achieve some of these sustainability objectives that they've set.
In some ways, this inflationary environment has maybe assisted in people recognizing that some of these things we've been arguing about for decades. It kind of a sober second thought. Is that a good way to put it? When you think about this?
I hope so. If there can be a silver lining, I mean, I certainly know that more people are talking about food than ever before, in light of the prices that we're paying at the grocery store. And that's here in Canada. And I understand from colleagues who have traveled to Europe, it's even more expensive in Europe. But when you look at an environmental proposal like Farm to Fork, for example, that I can't recall if it's by 2030 that they want to see 25% of their overall production move into organics. As a consumer, you can't help but think about, Sri Lanka is a bit of a dramatic case, but look, there's a case study for you in terms of what happens under those conditions when you see that much of a shift. And so hopefully people are pausing and thinking a bit about, what I'd said at the top, which is, are we really having the right conversations about climate change and the environment? Are we really thinking about the policies that we're putting in place? Are they going to get us any closer to where we really want to go?
Now, if the EU was to ban glyphosate, if that was a decision, there could be some trade impacts there for Canadian products and Canadian farming. We use glyphosate on things like burn off. I guess we have to wait for what some of the rules are, but there could be some real trade impacts on Canadian commodities going into the EU.
Well, and there would be, right? Like, we can't speculate on the outcome of the decision that will be taken in 2 weeks. We'll know soon enough. But in the event that they were to ban glyphosate, for example, in 2024, they would be certainly having a conversation about import tolerances. And that would be really unfortunate because glyphosate has been an important tool for Canadian farmers in reaching some of their sustainability objectives. And so, from the conversations that you've had with Canadian farmers, they pride themselves on their track record with continuous improvement over generations and the sustainable practices, in particular in Western Canada, when I cite conservation tillage as one example. Not possible without glyphosate. And so when you remove a tool like that from Canadian farmers, it's going to impact our ability to meet some of our own sustainability commitments. And so it would be a very short-sighted decision to take. And it's one that I hope they won't take. And I'm feeling quite optimistic that they're going to follow the science on this, because we've seen positive results both from EFSA and I think with respect to the proposal from the European Commission. So I think in a couple of weeks, we'll get good news on this one, Sean.
Erin, thanks a lot for your perspective. And once again, congratulations on your move to Canada Grains Council. Looking forward to future chats. Thanks so much.
Me too. Thanks, Sean.